Welcome to The Thriving Marriage, the podcast for those who want to get their spouse back in love with them and truly thrive.
You'll learn why 95% of people don't save their marriage and the secret method no one else is talking about that will change everything for you. Are you ready? Let's turn tragedy to triumph.
Here are your hosts, international marriage experts, Mark Johnston and Heather Choate.
Hey everyone, Mark Johnston here. I'm the head coach with High Thrive Coaching. Unfortunately, Heather's not able to make it this week, so I'm just going to be running the podcast solo. As we had discussed in the previous podcast from last week, we are going to discuss how to deal with your spouse's affair. Here with High Thrive Coaching, in the Thriving Marriage Facebook group, look, we get it. You know that your spouse is having an affair. You might have all the evidence in the world, even that this is going on. And, time and time again, we've encountered this sort of situation where you go to confront your spouse and they won't stop the affair. Either they refuse to stop, or they promise that they're going to stop only for you to catch them continuing to talk or engaging with their affair partner. Now, if you found yourself in this situation, you may feel as though your marriage or even your life is just really put on hold and while this affair continues. So what do you do in this situation? How do you put an end to this affair? What do you how do you handle this at all? I'm going to admit, affairs are one of the trickier problems in a marriage. So we want to give you several tips, hints, tricks to deal with this. But before we get to that, I do want to discuss our client win of the week. Now, this one is from an anonymous user. A client of ours was talking about some wins that she had just recently. Now, was a great situation. I always enjoy hearing these kind of wins from the people that I work with personally. So she was telling me just this last week how her husband has now decided to work on the marriage. He decided to end his affair and he's put his ring back on. And during this discussion of this win, we did recognize, my client and I, that there was still a lot of work to do, that there's some, a lot of things to work through, but these were huge steps for her. She had been fighting for these things for quite some time. And, the reason why I wanted to share this one in particular is because we are discussing affairs. And because in this client's particular situation, her husband was saying over and over again that it's over and done with, even though he kept on communicating with this affair partner. But we now have, with this particular client, proof that he has officially ended it. And so this is big things. This is what we do here with High Thrive Coaching, is help people in these dire circumstances like this. So we want to talk about affairs. What I find interesting about this is this is a heated topic. This is a really hot button topic. A lot of people, when they are going to look up marriage advice, this seems to be at the top of the list in terms of problems that need to get solved. And I always, when I go to write or to prepare for these podcasts or prepare to write some trainings that I create or material for our clients, I always like to go and see what other experts are saying on the matter, just to get some thoughts and ideas and whatnot. It's always good to keep up to date with what other experts are saying. Now I've gotten to a point where I can look at other people's their suggestions or whatnot, and I can look at it with a bit of a critic's eye and say, okay, well, this is a good piece of advice, but that is not, and whatnot. Now, what I tended to see is a lot of the flashier type of sites that I went to, the ones that were advertising the quick fix or whatnot, they gave these like blanket answers for how to handle an affair. And I want to set things straight right from the beginning, is that there's not going to be any universal single answer to the question, what do you do when your spouse is having an affair? There isn't. And if you go in and hear other, experts talking about how you just do this one thing or you do these 5 things, whatever number that they happen to be using to kind of hook you in on reading their article or listening to their video, there just aren't any universal answers. Many factors change how you might handle an affair, and it may depend on, for instance, why your spouse is having an affair to begin with, whether they openly admit to the affair or not, whether they themselves recognize their actions as an affair, whether your spouse still wants the marriage to continue or not, whether the affair partner is also married or not, and so on and so on and so on. As you can, like, an affair is a really, really complicated thing. With one client whose spouse really wants the marriage to still work, we might absolutely be talking about setting boundaries and having these deep discussions with your spouse, as opposed to another situation, another marriage where a husband or wife is stepping out of the marriage and they're saying, you know what, I don't want to end this affair, and they're trying to negotiate that sort of situation, or they might say that they're done with the marriage. It's a very, very different situation in handling that affair, because there's a lot of different factors. So like I said, I've heard many experts give these universal solutions, and many of them have a good chance of backfiring if you're not really applying them right. Like I'm going to go through the most common universal solutions. Now, first off, almost always I hear a suggestion of setting boundaries, putting your foot down, setting high consequences, which in some circumstances does work. But, essentially what this solution involves, it means confronting your spouse, letting them know that they don't stop, then they're going to have to leave, or perhaps you escalate the situation into a threat of divorce. Well, the problem here, that solution might work if the cheating partner is highly motivated in keeping the marriage. In this sort of circumstance, you back off, you set these high consequences, you set these firm boundaries, and they start to look at their affair partner and say, okay, is this person worth my marriage, my life, my relationship with my children? Is it worth that sacrifice? And a lot of times they might say no. At the same time, though, this sort of solution does not, when people go about thinking about it in this way, it doesn't address why the cheating partner started an affair in the first place. Further, what happens if the cheating partner is not super interested in their marriage anymore? It can backfire, essentially reinforcing the cheating partner's desire to step outside the marriage. Or we can go in the other direction. I know a lot of really well-intentioned coaches and therapists and whatnot, they say, okay, we need to be really understanding. I just mentioned, I said, okay, the previous solution doesn't address why the partner is having the affair in the first place. So why don't we try to understand that? Why don't we give this spouse some time to sort things out? Why don't we give them a lot of understanding and empathy? Why don't we try to fill in those gaps in the marriage? What this solution essentially involves, involves continually telling your spouse how hurtful their behavior is, but ultimately you don't really do anything about it. You might try to talk to them and try to make them happy, but nothing's done. Many wouldn't even consider this a solution, but there are a lot of experts out there that claim the spouse who's been cheated on needs to be given some grace and some understanding and some compassion. Now, the problem with this is if you keep going to your spouse over and over and over again saying how unhappy you are, this, it's akin to nagging, or it runs the risk of crossing that line into desperation or begging, as you say, please stop having this affair. And that is a terrible situation to be in. You absolutely, in that sort of situation, have very little respect for yourself. And that is not a healthy foundation to build your marriage off of again. There basically isn't any reason to end the affair if there are zero consequences. Essentially, your spouse is able to have their cake and eat it too by engaging in an affair and only occasionally having to deal with some guilt or shame or negativity because of that affair. What will end up happening, very, very likely, is that your spouse will simply end up lying about further involvement with their affair partner. In other words, if there's too much understanding, if there's too much compassion and trying to appease the cheating partner, they're only really going to be motivated to hide their affair rather than actually deal with the affair. So if you can't be overly permissive, you can't be overly stern, what do we do about this? This is what, where as I'm, like I said, as I'm looking at other experts' advice on this, I often think, okay, their solution is not complete. It's not universal by any means. And like I said, there's not going to be a whole lot of universal answers out there. Just because these situations are very, very complicated, and it needs, a lot of examination, a lot of feedback from an expert. It needs a lot to handle these sort of situations well. But what I want to do, because I can't meet with each of you individually, we have enough listeners here now, that's just not possible for me to do that with each and every one of you. Of course, we do have other team members. If you are looking for that additional help, of course, we do always offer that. But what I want to do today is I want to give you some tips that will generally move you in the right direction. And these are more stances or general positions that you should take rather than, okay, you need to, like, specific pieces of advice, like you need to put your foot down, you need to set these consequences. So the stance or general direction number one is a matter of self-respect. Make sure you have an abundance of it. Now, having self-respect in this situation is not necessarily about putting your foot down. It's not about punishing your spouse or demanding that he or she end the affair. At the same time, those things might be needed to maintain self-respect. Now, this might seem like I'm contradicting myself. It might seem a bit paradoxical in terms of dealing with the affair, but self-respect really isn't about what you do to your spouse. It's not. It's about how you consider and support yourself. And I want to say that again because this is very important. Self-respect is not about punishments. It's not about consequences for your spouse. That's not self-respect. That's what you're doing to them. Self-respect is how you respect yourself, how you consider yourself, how you have understanding for yourself, how you have support for yourself. So you need to ask yourself, are you happy? Do you feel fulfilled by yourself? Are you taking care of your own needs or standing up for yourself or standing up for your needs? Or are you begging, pleading, demanding, crying, stonewalling, punishing, etc., etc., etc.? All these things directed towards someone else. If you want to attract your spouse back, it will be necessary that you're happy in and of yourself apart from your marriage. It's also going to be important that you command respect for yourself. Having self-respect might mean setting boundaries. It might mean consequences for continued actions within the affair. It might mean those consequences for your spouse's behavior, but your mindset and your motivation about why these boundaries and consequences are coming is important. If you're going into this and saying, my spouse has hurt me, so I need to punish them, you're going about this all wrong. And you might be saying to yourself, well, I'm not going to tell them that this is punishment for them. But if you are thinking that way, if you feel that way, if you're feeling all this hurt as you are setting consequences, as you are setting boundaries, it will show through. You might not believe me because you might say, okay, oh, I'm really good at hiding my feelings. But I want to ask you, I mean, those of you who have been married for some time, do you know when your spouse is upset? Do you recognize when they are feeling off, when they are feeling a little bit depressed, when they're a little bit sluggish? Do you notice when they are a little bit more chipper or excited or happy? They don't have to spell these things out to you, but I'm sure if you've been married for any length of time, if you've been with your partner for any length of time, any decent amount of time, you probably recognize these things. Even if your spouse is a little bit more quiet, even if they're a little bit more reserved, you start to recognize these things. Like me, I deal with people's feelings all the time. Me, myself, I tend to be actually a little bit more reserved. Compared to my wife, she has much higher highs, she has lower lows, and I tend to be kind of right in that middle area. My wife and I, we've been married for 15 years, and she will often say, you know what, I know, commenting on me, she's like, I know a lot of people might not recognize when you're upset or sad or when you're excited about something. She's saying, I do. And I'm sure all of you recognize the same thing. So if you are coming at your boundaries, if you're coming at, setting some consequences, and you're doing this in an angry fashion, it will come across that way. Your spouse will notice, and it's going to backfire. So the principle is more about self-respect, what you're doing for yourself, rather than punishment for what they are doing. The same actions might be taken. So maybe you are setting a boundaries, for instance, in terms of whether your spouse can remain living with you in the same house. On the one side, if you're saying, hey, I need to make sure that I am respecting myself. This is not feeling good for me, and I need to have some space for this to feel better. It's very different from you're having an affair, you need to move out. The second one is that angry sort of stance. And it might, I'll admit, in some cases that may have an impact, it may have an effect, but not in all circumstances. The healthier version, the one that's going to have more impact across a wider variety of circumstances, is the self-respect stance. Okay, our second stance here is about understanding. Now, if you've been listening to us for any length of time, you know that I hammer on this point over and over and over again. Understanding and empathy and perspective. I mean, we talk about our PATH method. The P in that PATH method stands for perspective. And I am all about having better understanding. Because frankly, I think that in a lot of situations, there's not enough of that. And this leads to a lot of pieces of the marriage really collapsing in on itself. Understanding in this circumstance is about knowing what is creating a situation that allows for an affair. I'm going to make a point in that something in your partner's life created a situation that made the affair possible. It might not even be you, but we need to understand what actually was going on that your spouse would even consider engaging in this sort of situation. I will say that in most cases, a spouse, a partner is not setting out saying, okay, I'm going to go out and start an affair today. In most cases, it happens little by little. They say, okay, this is just a friend. It's okay for me to talk with this other person. It's okay for me to hang out with this other person. It's okay for me to sit in the car, and there's all these justifications. But somewhere along the way, these justifications were made possible by other factors in your relationship. Perhaps there's been a loss of love. Perhaps there's an overabundance of stress in your partner's life. Perhaps you and your partner have lost the thrill and excitement that used to be in the marriage, and it's just ho-hum, boring, same thing day after day after day, with very little attention or interest. Perhaps there's grown an underlying tension between the two of you, and there's a lot of arguments. Perhaps you don't. Perhaps there isn't enough conversation and understanding. Perhaps your spouse doesn't feel understood. Perhaps you don't talk to them. But whatever it happens to be, something is in there in the relationship where your partner needs to justify engaging in a relationship like this. And if you want your spouse to end their affair, then you need to consider why these things are happening. If your spouse feels better understood and as though there is a lot of respect for them and their concerns, well, there's a lot more motivation to end the affair. If your spouse is, if their concerns are addressed and like your interactions are not just okay, but thrilling and exciting and passionate, if they look forward to coming home to see you, that's not a situation that really makes an affair a good option. If they are risking losing something great, then there's much more, and I hate this word, but it's applicable here, there's much more leverage to ask your partner to stop. Now, this does not mean that you beg them to come back because you have found the solution, but it does mean that you listen to your spouse and consider how they feel. These are the two big pillars here. These are, as I'm going to say, I'm not going to call these universal solutions, but these are the two pillars that I think you need to focus on, is that self-respect and understanding. And if you can really push on those two factors, you're going to be in a much better position to fix all the things that are going on in terms of the affair. Now, of course, our discussion today is not exhaustive by any means. There are a lot of pitfalls in dealing with affairs. I made some time ago a 4-part training, each of them about an hour long, with slides and whatnot, on dealing with affairs. And I think that is great information, but still not 100% exhaustive, because as I said at the very beginning, there are not universal answers on how to deal with something so complicated like an affair. Perhaps if I went through every single scenario that could happen, maybe we might have some good answers somewhere in there. But I think the best option is often to get some professional help. So please consider scheduling a complimentary call if you're not already engaged with our services. Also, something to consider, I want to know down below in the comments, are you interested in us re-releasing our affair workshop? Would you be interested in having access to that 4-part training? Or would you even be interested in a live training, extensive training on handling affairs? If you are interested in this, let us know in the comments. And, we're always looking at these for what our next projects are. So, if we get enough interest, we very well might send out an announcement that we're doing another workshop like this. So with that said, I hope that was helpful in terms of, helping you to know what the direction that you should go in handling your affair. So with that, we are going to go into the marriage myth buster for the week. Now, I always like to come up with these myths, or to use the myths that are associated with the topic for the week. So today's myth is the idea of we're just friends. The myth that, that one can end an affair and still maintain contact or friendship with an affair partner. And we see variations of this, especially, if your partner never really admitted to the affair in the first place. They continually claimed, okay, that it's just friendship. Here's the thing, though. Especially when there has been an affair, but in many other cases as well, the idea of a close opposite sex friendship, in my opinion, is a big threat. Now, am I saying here that men and women can't be friends? I'm not saying that, but I am saying that a certain amount of care needs to be had in those circumstances. And I certainly do not recommend close friendship with members of the opposite sex if you're in a committed relationship. I remember hearing someone a long time ago. Now, this was, probably 10, 15 years ago. I remember I used to listen to someone, his name's Glenn Beck. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. And I'm not going to get into political views or anything. I've lost track of him. In terms of politics, my views have changed over the years. But I'm not even going to talk about the politics side of things on him. I remember something that he said at some point, is he was talking about how when he goes out to like a bar or something. Now he used to have a big drinking problem. I do remember this. And furthermore, he really valued his marriage. So he was talking about the concept of avoiding the appearance of evil. He called it the appearance of evil. Those were his words. And so what he would do is he didn't want it to even be assumed that he was drinking or assumed that he might be conducting inappropriate interactions with someone of the opposite gender. And so he made a point. He said when he goes to the bar, he makes a point of being served his drink in a can or bottle, because he might drink a soda there, something that clearly labels the drink that he's drinking. If he's going to be with, having to do business with a female, then he makes sure that there are other people around, that it's in a public place, that it looks very professional, or perhaps if it's a casual engagement, that his wife is there. And, he tries very hard to avoid the appearance of anything, unseemly or in his words, evil. And this is, in terms of the idea of we're just friends, this is the kind of stance that we should have with something so important as our marriage. If your marriage is that important to you, then you want to make sure that, you want to avoid the appearance that anything could be, anything other than what you're looking for it to be. If you are just friends, then make sure that it avoids any possibility that it could be anything more than that. This is why this is a myth, is because the idea that if you are having to get to a point where you're having to explain to someone that you are just friends, you've already crossed that line. And this is why it's a myth. You've crossed that line if you have to defend yourself on that front. And there are things that you are going to need to reconsider. Now, if this is your spouse saying that they're just friends, depends on your marriage and your ability to talk about these things. But I think there does need to be a discussion. Not to say that you telling your partner that you can't be friends with members of the opposite gender, but perhaps how that can be okay and how it can avoid the appearance of anything else. How you can be secure with them being just friends with this other person. And that's really my stance on this myth of being just friends. And, it's, for me in my marriage, it served me well. I know Sure, I might miss out on, it's possible that I might miss out on a deeper, closer relationship with some women. But to me, it's not that important. It's much more important, that my wife feels secure in the relationship, that we feel good around each other, that there isn't really any suspicion. And if you really value your marriage, then you either want to move in that direction yourself, or you want to help your spouse, support them in moving in that direction. So with that said, thank you all for listening. As I was mentioning earlier, please, if you are having trouble with an affair, consider getting on a complimentary call with one of our team members to see if our program could be a good fit for you. If you are looking for something a little less intense, let us know in the comments if you would like us to run another workshop on affairs. I am all for updating our material or running the workshop again. Let us know. We like to get your feedback on these sort of things, and to check in what kind of direction we should head with a lot of our efforts and our new materials. So with that, once again, thank you all for listening. Check us out next week. We're going to have a wonderful podcast then as well. And I hope you all have a good week.
Thanks for listening to The Thriving Marriage, your A to Z blueprint for not just surviving marriage, but thriving. Until next time, my friends, thrive on.